Alright, I begin this third lesson, and hopefully this will be the final one. There's a lot of terminology to work our way through here, but one of these, but basically what happens is there's a lot of terminology to work through, but I'm going to try to do it quickly so we do okay. So there's a few just sort of technical terms. One of them is body text. You have your headline, you have your byline, you have your dateline. The rest of this stuff, this information, which I'll pull over here just so you see a little bigger, is nothing more than what we call body text. It's just a technical term for it. It's nothing particularly fancy or anything. It's the text that makes the body of the story. The next thing is a graph. A graph is just slang for a paragraph. Any paragraph we sometimes refer to as just a graph. So that's not really a huge terminology concept. The bigger issue with things like graph is that sometimes I'll say like, well, move this graph up, or this seems like it should be its own graph, or things like that. And that's just saying paragraph. It's just slang. We talk about graphs, like we could use a few more graphs on this, or this is just a couple graphs too long. It's just saying paragraphs. It's just a quick way to say it, and that's all that is. Next thing, if we come back to the front page, if you come down here, you have these things here. These are called a jump line, and the part that follows it is called the jump. If you come down here, it'll say, you know, see director, page 9. That's the jump line. It's telling you to go to the story about it on page 9. You go to page 9 by clicking the link. The story jumps over here, and so it's jumping from page to page. If you come down the bottom of the story, and I'll pull it up over here so we can see it. One of my problems is kind of going both ways with that. If you get down the bottom, there's what we call a column tag. A column tag is just this information at the end that says, you know, if you want to contact the reporter, there's how, Twitter information, etc. Sometimes they'll have something like Dave Backey. If you read his columns, he'll, at the end of his, they'll say, you know, Dave Backey is always looking for interesting stories, blah, blah, blah. You know, usually he has a little sort of plug for contacting him to give him story ideas. And so, you know, that's just whatever information, you know, about contacting the reporter. It's called a column tag. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is we have this concept of, sorry. Hopefully we're still recording. The other concept we have is we have, a column, just as long as we're in that column vein. A column is basically, you know, if you look here at this page, if you look and you count across, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. The standard broadsheet, the difference in broadsheet is, you know, like the State Journal Register is a broadsheet. It's a big, broad piece of paper, wide piece of paper, and that's called a broadsheet. And a tabloid is, you know, like, for example, the Illinois Times or the National Enquirer. Those are all tabloids, and that's actually just a style of page where it's a smaller page. It's about half the size of a regular newspaper. And so a standard tabloid has 5 columns. A standard broadsheet has 6 columns. The Lamp being kind of a mix between the two. The school paper is a 5-column count, and so there's 5 columns across on the page. What happens is that's how we measure a page. Every page has, you know, 6 columns, and each column is about 20 to 21 inches, depending upon the press. Long, which means from top to bottom, it's about 21 inches, which means there's about 100 inches on a page, give or take a few inches. And so each page has 100 column inches. So a column inch is basically just how many inches of columns you have. And so nothing particularly interesting, but, you know, it's something at least to keep in mind. You know, how much space a story is going to take up is, you know, is basically just a mathematical function of you know, a column is you know, 1/6 of a page wide. It's about 2 inches, inch and a half, 2 inches, somewhere in that ballpark. And they're, you know, they go down 21 inches. And so if you have a 20-inch story, you know that takes about 1/5 of the page. If you have art and you have cut lines and you have headlines and you have a couple little reefer boxes or other things or little promos in it, you know, little art pieces, then, you know, it could end up easily being 60, 70 inches. It could take up half a page. But that's just something to keep in mind. A column is the way they traditionally measured stories. A story in a newspaper is usually about 12 to 15 column inches. A column inch is, you know, here we have this column. You know, an inch of the story probably goes about, that first paragraph is probably about an inch long, although, you know, exactly measuring it from a computer screen to print is a little difficult. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there'd be about 6 to 7 lines, about 6.5 lines in an inch. So that's about an inch. What you could do is, you know, you want to kind of get an idea. Each one of those lines has anywhere from, like, the first one has 4, second one has 6, next one has 4 words in it. Next one has 5, next one has 4, next one has 3. So it's, you know, about 4 to 5 words per line, and there's about 6.5 lines, so it's about 35 to 40 words in a column inch. So, for example, I told you the average story is about 12 to 15 inches. That means the average story is somewhere between about 480 to 600 words long. And so that's basically the way you measure stories, is either by column inches or word count. Now, next term is bastard measure. One of my favorite concepts here. My example comes from, I had to look for the page it was being covered up that my example is on. On page 21 gives you an example. You know, if you look here, this top, there's a column of briefs over here, and then you have this story, and if you notice, it's got 5 legs to it. Underneath there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is 6 columns wide, this page. But if you come down here, you have 1 column over here for the briefs, but then if you look here, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4 legs of text, and it, you know, as it wraps around this photo. What that is that's called a bastard measure. Basically, it means is that, you know, that the person designing the page has decided that they didn't want it in regular columns. They wanted to make the picture a little bit different size. They wanted to stand out a little bit. It's really just a design matter, and so they did it in a bastard measure is what that is. So that's just something kind of to keep in mind as you're looking. Sometimes you use that just to change the photo. Sometimes you do it just because, you know, everything being columns straight down doesn't look all that visually appealing. There's various reasons, but those are some of the main reasons. The only thing to keep in mind about breaking from the column rules and using a bastard measure is that, you know, there is a kind of a concept in that people, you know, if your columns are really skinny, people are kind of reading like one word and jumping to the next one. People get really tired of that when they're reading. They like to be able to track across. But at the same time, people also don't want to track across too long before getting to the next line, because A, it's just maybe at times cumbersome, but B, the other problem is trying to find the next line becomes difficult, because you know, it's like, wait, I'm way across. No, you know, you lose your spot as you're jumping back. Where was I at? Many of you probably experienced this with a really long email or something where you're having trouble figuring out where the line, you know, you get down the side, it says, you know, Bill will be there, blah, 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 you know, and then you're going, which line at the other end of this page is actually the start of the end of the previous line? You know, it's just sort of a tracking issue with trying to keep up with it. And so, you know, the idea though is, you know, you can do it, but you don't want to make your columns ever too wide or too thin. Now, as we move along, I'm just looking at my time there. We have the concept of a cut line. If we come here to a photo and we look at it, if you come down here, there's different styles, but it's basically just the information. Every photo should have a cut line. Now, sometimes they don't. But even something simple like this, it's clearly this photo was chosen because it's about pumping gasoline, and that's why it was there. It's nothing more than just, it was something to illustrate the story about gas under $2. But you still should have a cut line. Typically, a cut line should give the name of the person in the photo. It should give you a little bit about the story and sort of connect it back to the story. There's a whole section in the AP style book about what should be in it, but every photo should have a cut line, and we call it a cut line. Other people call it a caption spine, but that's what we call it. Art. Art is anything. A photo is art. Even like a graphic could be an art. Anything that basically is a visual element we call art. But the main art we talk about is photos. And that's just, just to keep in mind that photos oftentimes in journalism slang are actually just called art. Like, what art do we have? They're not saying what photos do we have. They'll say what art do we have. Agate. This is an interesting concept, one that you should be familiar with. But if you come to in a sports section of the paper, if you come up here, for example, there's always this section that's long columns of just information. And if you come over and look at it closely, it'll give you things like high school standings for boys basketball, and they'll show the wins and losses for each of these. And you come over here and they'll have, all kinds of information, who scored how many runs or how many baskets or whatever else there is in this. And all that is it's just basic information that sports fans want to know. And so it's called agate. They usually put it in very small print, and it takes a little bit of effort if you have eyesight problems to read it. But you can get all the details that maybe the reporter didn't manage to get in. And so, for example, if we click it so it's in more of a regular format, I mean, you can see stuff like, it'll say here, how are people shooting 3-point field goals, or what's this one says? I'm trying to figure out what this. Trying to figure out where I was at. I mean, 3-point field goals. Williamsville 3. Drew Keenan had 1. Matt Watson had 1. And it gives you all this information that becomes perhaps as a sports fan you might want to see, or your kid you want to see how they did, and you can keep track of it. And that's called agate. A-G-A-T-E. I already talked about entry points. I talked about column tags. As we move down our list of terms, slug. The thing is that depending upon where a story goes in the newspaper, the exact page that it's going to go on, or exact location, it's going to change. So, for example, this page here, well, that's not probably a great example. I should go to the local page. This story, if the reporter had written the headline, they might have written something a lot longer than what would fit there. And then if the reporter had written a headline for this, well, it has to go in one column. So it has to be like one word each line, or this plan for city. It would have to be very tight, very well broken. It would be very difficult to just happen upon a headline for that. And so headlines are typically written by the copy desk or the editors, because they actually know where the story is going to go and how it's going to fit and how they want to play it. And this can go for TV, this can go for radio, it can go for anything, blogs and everything. It's maybe a little bit easier in those formats, but typically all we do in journalism, whether it be for TV, radio, or newspapers, we just give stories slugs. So, for example, Amazon to start collecting sales tax. We would probably just call this a sales tax or Amazon tax or something like that. Announces economic plan for city. We probably just call that economic plan. Usually it's 1 or 2, maybe 3 words the most that describe the story. This one, U of I president concerned about future. We might go future U of I, or we might go with U of I president, or university president. Things like that would be different slugs. And a slug is just basically just a 1, 2, 3 word summary of the story. And so what they'll say is, as it moves around a newsroom, they'll say, oh, what about that U of I president story? Or what about that Amazon tax story, or that sales tax story? Those would all be examples of how that's used. And usually we use slugs versus that. Instead of saying what the city council talked about, you just say, what about the council story? What about the council this? What about the basketball game? Instead of, what about the story about Sacred Heart Griffin beating such and such school? What about the story about Rochester winning its game against so 4-7? That's all excessive information. We just keep it to the very basic slug. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're writing stories. Don't bother to write headlines for them. Just give us a slug. Just at the top, you put at the top, what I always suggest is, you have your byline and then the slug at the top. The top of the page should just have a slug, just a 1-word description, not a headline.